You wake up, you work, you achieve, and yet something inside you whispers, you don't belong here. Not loudly, not dramatically, quietly, like a shadow that follows you into every room you enter. You smile when people praise you, but inside something tightens. You feel exposed, like they've made a mistake, like they've seen something in you that isn't real. And the strangest part? You don't talk about it. Because how do you explain something that doesn't make sense even to you? You've done the work. You've put in the hours. You've earned the results. But your mind refuses to accept the verdict. Instead, it creates a story, a dangerous one. It tells you that you got lucky, that people overestimate you, that sooner or later they'll find out. And when that moment comes, everything will collapse. This is the silent war of imposter syndrome. And if you're listening right now, there's a high chance you're not just familiar with it. You're living in it. You see, most people think imposter syndrome is about low confidence. It's not. Some of the most confident-looking people, the ones others admire, the ones who seem like they have everything figured out, are the ones fighting this the hardest. Because imposter syndrome doesn't attack your weaknesses. It attacks your strengths. It shows up after success. It whispers after validation. It grows after achievement. And that's what makes it so dangerous. Because no matter how far you go, it keeps moving the finish line. You land a new opportunity. Your mind says, you're not ready. You succeed. Your mind says, that was luck. You get praised. Your mind says, they don't know the real you. And slowly, without realizing it, you start disconnecting from your own reality. You stop trusting your own abilities. You start shrinking in moments where you should be expanding. You hold back when you should speak up. You hesitate when you should act. You doubt when you should decide. And over time, you become smaller than your potential. Not because you lack skill, not because you lack intelligence, but because you've been convinced you're an illusion. Now here's where it gets uncomfortable. Imposter syndrome doesn't come from nowhere. It has roots, deep ones. Sometimes it starts in childhood when love or approval was tied to performance. You learned that being good enough wasn't enough. You had to be better, smarter, perfect. And even when you achieved that, the standard moved. So you grew up chasing something that was never clearly defined. And now as an adult, you're still chasing it, still trying to prove something, still waiting for that moment where you finally feel like, yes, now I'm enough. But that moment never comes. Because imposter syndrome feeds on one belief, that your worth is conditional. And if your worth is conditional, then no achievement will ever feel permanent. You'll always feel like you're borrowing success instead of owning it. You'll always feel like you're one mistake away from losing everything. And that fear, it changes how you live. You overwork, not because you're driven, but because you're afraid of being exposed. You overthink, not because you're careful, but because you're scared of being wrong. You avoid opportunities, not because you're lazy, but because deep down you don't believe you deserve them. And here's the part nobody tells you. Imposter syndrome doesn't protect you. It limits you. You think it keeps you humble, but it actually keeps you small. You think it pushes you to improve, but it actually traps you in self-doubt. You think it's making you realistic, but it's distorting your perception of reality. Because the truth is, you are not an imposter. You are just someone who hasn't learned how to accept their own growth. Let that sink in, because growth feels unfamiliar. And your brain is wired to distrust what's unfamiliar. So when you step into a new level, a bigger room, a higher standard, your mind reacts, not with celebration, but with suspicion. Something's off. This isn't me. I don't belong here. But that's not truth. That's adjustment. That's your identity catching up to your reality. And most people never realize this. So they stay stuck. They keep playing smaller roles in bigger lives. They keep dimming their light in rooms that need it the most. They keep waiting for permission that will never come, because the world doesn't hand out validation in the way you expect. And even if it did, you wouldn't believe it. That's the trap. External proof doesn't fix internal doubt. So what does? Awareness. Brutal, uncomfortable awareness. The moment you recognize that the voice in your head is not always telling the truth, the moment you start questioning your own self-doubt instead of automatically believing it. Because think about it. If someone else spoke to you the way your inner voice does, you wouldn't trust them. You wouldn't listen to them. You wouldn't take them seriously. But because it's your own mind, you accept it without question. And that's where everything changes. The moment you stop blindly believing your doubts is the moment they lose power over you. You start seeing patterns. You start noticing how your mind reacts in certain situations. You start catching those thoughts in real time. And instead of shrinking, you pause, you observe, you choose. You don't need to eliminate imposter syndrome completely. That's not realistic. Even the most successful people feel it sometimes. The difference is they don't let it control their actions. They feel the doubt and move anyway. They hear the voice and ignore it. They step forward even when they don't feel ready because they understand something most people don't. Confidence is not the absence of doubt. It's the decision to act despite it. And once you start doing that, everything shifts. You begin to build evidence, real undeniable evidence, not based on what you feel, but based on what you do. And slowly, your identity starts to change. You stop seeing yourself as someone who got lucky and start seeing yourself as someone who shows up, who learns, who adapts, who grows. And that's when imposter syndrome starts losing its grip. Not overnight, not instantly, but gradually, because you're no longer feeding it. You're no longer reinforcing the story. You're rewriting it one action at a time. So if you've been feeling like a fraud, like you don't belong, like you're one step away from being exposed, understand this. You're not broken. You're evolving. You're stepping into spaces that require a new version of you. And that version doesn't feel natural yet. But that doesn't mean it's not real. It just means you're not used to it yet. And the only way to get used to it is to keep going, even when it feels uncomfortable, even when it feels uncertain, even when that voice tries to pull you back. Because that voice, it's not your limit, it's your resistance. And resistance only shows up when you're moving in the right direction. Good, because this is where most people stop. They hear something like this, they feel it, it resonates, and for a moment they think, that's me. And then they go right back to living the same way. Because insight feels powerful, but it doesn't change behavior unless you do something with it. And imposter syndrome knows that. It thrives in awareness without action. It wants you to understand it, but not challenge it. Because the moment you start challenging it, it starts losing control. So let's go deeper. There's a pattern you probably haven't noticed yet. Every time you're about to level up, something inside you pulls back. Not always dramatically. Sometimes it's subtle. You delay sending that message. You hesitate before speaking. You rewrite something 10 times before sharing it. You tell yourself, I just need a little more time, a little more preparation, a little more certainty. But that little more never ends. Because it's not about preparation. It's about permission. And you're waiting for a level of certainty that doesn't exist. You think successful people feel ready. They don't. They just move anyway. That's the difference. Not talent, not intelligence, not even confidence, just willingness to act while feeling uncertain. But imposter syndrome flips that logic. It convinces you that action should come after confidence, that you should wait until you feel like you belong, before you behave like you belong. And that's why people stay stuck for years, because confidence is not a prerequisite. It's a result. You don't get confidence, then act. You act, then build confidence. But if you never act, you never build it. So you stay in this loop, thinking, analyzing, doubting, waiting, and calling it being careful when it's actually fear wearing a smarter mask. Now here's another uncomfortable truth. Imposter syndrome often hides behind perfectionism. You tell yourself you just want to do things right. You say you have high standards. You say you don't want to put out something unless it's your best. Sounds noble, right? But look closer. Perfectionism isn't about excellence. It's about protection. Because if something is never finished, it can never be judged. If you never put yourself out there, you never risk being exposed. So you stay in preparation mode. You keep refining. You keep adjusting. You keep waiting for the perfect moment. But perfection is a moving target. And deep down, you know that. So what's really happening? You're avoiding vulnerability. You're avoiding the moment where your work meets reality, where people can see it, where people can respond to it, where people can judge it. And more importantly, where you have to face the truth that you're not perfect, that you're still learning, that you're still growing. And imposter syndrome hates that exposure because it feeds on the illusion that you have to be flawless to be valid. But reality doesn't work like that. Nobody you admire got there by being perfect. They got there by being visible, by making mistakes, by learning in public, by showing up before they felt ready. And that's the part nobody talks about. You're comparing your internal doubts to someone else's external results. You don't see their hesitation. You don't see their fear. You don't see the moments where they question themselves. You only see the outcome. And you measure yourself against that, which is an unfair comparison from the start because you're playing two different games. They're playing the game of action. You're stuck in the game of validation. And validation is a game you can't win because no matter how much you get, it never feels like enough. You could have 100 people telling you you're amazing and one voice inside saying you're not. And guess which one you believe? That's the power of internal narrative. It overrides external reality. So the real question isn't, how do I get more validation? It's, why don't I trust the validation I already have? Because that's where the real work is. Not out there. In here. In the way you interpret your own experiences. In the meaning you assign to your own success. In the story you keep repeating to yourself. Because every time you succeed and call it luck, you reinforce the belief that you're not capable. Every time you minimize your effort, you weaken your sense of ownership. Every time you say it wasn't a big deal, you teach your brain that your achievements don't count. And over time, you build a reality where nothing you do ever feels like enough, not because it isn't, but because you've trained yourself not to see it. And that's where you need to interrupt the pattern. You don't need to become arrogant. You don't need to overinflate your ego. You just need to start being honest about your effort, honest about your progress, honest about the fact that you didn't get here by accident because luck doesn't show up consistently. Luck doesn't build patterns. Luck doesn't create growth. You did that even if it doesn't feel like it, even if part of you resists that idea, because accepting your own competence feels unfamiliar, and unfamiliar feels uncomfortable. But discomfort is not danger. It's growth. And this is where most people get it wrong. They interpret discomfort as a sign to stop, when it's actually a sign to continue, because every level of growth comes with a new level of discomfort, a new level of uncertainty, a new level of self-doubt. That doesn't mean you're going backward. It means you're expanding. But if you keep retreating every time it feels uncomfortable, you'll never stabilize at that new level. You'll keep falling back into what feels safe, what feels familiar, even if it's smaller than what you're capable of. So the real shift happens when you change your relationship with discomfort, when you stop asking, why do I feel like this? And start asking, what does this feeling mean? Because feeling like an imposter in a new environment might not mean you don't belong. It might mean you've outgrown your old identity and your mind is trying to catch up. That's a completely different perspective. And perspective changes everything, because the same feeling that once made you shrink can now become a signal that you're leveling up, that you're stepping into something bigger, that you're doing something that matters. And once you start seeing it that way, you stop running from it. You start leaning into it. You start recognizing that this discomfort is part of the process, not a problem to eliminate. And that shift alone can change the trajectory of your life. Because now, instead of waiting to feel ready, you move while feeling uncertain. Instead of avoiding situations that trigger doubt, you enter them deliberately. Instead of shrinking in moments of pressure, you expand into them. And over time, those moments stop feeling foreign. They start feeling familiar because you've been there before. You've handled it before. You've proven to yourself that you can survive it. And that's how confidence is built. Not through thinking, through experience, through repetition, through action. So the next time that voice shows up, and don't try to silence it. Don't try to fight it. Just recognize it. Name it. This is that pattern again. And then move anyway. Because your actions matter more than your thoughts. Every time. And if you keep choosing action over doubt, eventually your identity has no choice but to evolve. Because identity follows behavior, not the other way around. You don't become confident, then act. You act, then become confident. And once that clicks, you stop waiting. You stop hesitating. You stop asking for permission. And you start building something real, something grounded, something that isn't based on how you feel in the moment, but on what you consistently do. And that's when imposter syndrome starts to fade into the background, not because it disappears completely, but because it no longer controls you. It becomes noise, and you become focused. And when that happens, you realize something powerful. You were never an imposter. You were just someone who didn't know how to trust their own growth until now.